When I was a little boy and in my bath, my mother always told me to wash behind my ears and scrub my neck. I don't know why she was so interested in my ears and my neck. Maybe we'll find out in this story. It's called Smelly Boys. Pumpkin and Pickle loved playing with the Niffy-Pong children. We've already met Spud and Nesta. They are the oldest of the Niffy-Pong children. Then comes Aspen, a 5-year-old boy with very curly, almost red hair. 3-year-old Saffron, a pretty little girl who already has her hair in plaits. And finally there is Jojo, the 1-year-old who has just learnt how to walk, although it is true to say he is still a bit wobbly and often falls over when he tries to go too fast. Mr. Niffy-Pong was very good at making toys out of bits of wood he found in the orchard and forest, or that Jacob the gardener had thrown away. He made little dolls for the girls, which were all very smartly dressed, because Nesta and her friend Seraphine were always making new clothes for them. As boys, Spud and Aspen were more interested in things like fishing rods, swings, and bow and arrows. Then there were little trucks with wheels on that you could drag around on the end of a piece of string. These were the favourite toys of Saffron and Jojo, because you could fill them up with grass, stones, and bits of mud, and pretend you were builders or gardeners. Perhaps the best toy was a rather large one, because you could put Saffron and Jojo in it. It was a small cart with a long handle. Spud and Nesta often pretended they were donkeys pulling the cart. They often did this with Aspen and Jojo shouting and laughing happily as they were dragged racing through the forest or round and round the big pond. It was often a very bumpy ride, as the cart trundled wildly over big stones or ridges in the path, making Aspen and Jojo bounce up and down until they were almost thrown out. But the more they bounced, the more they laughed, holding on tightly to the special rail their father had fixed for their protection. It seems Spud always had some kind of interesting plan or adventure in mind, which meant he was usually the leader of the gang, because all the children wanted to do whatever he wanted to do. One day, after it had been raining and everywhere was rather slippery, he smoothed out a long strip on the largest compost heap from its top down to the ground. Then, sitting on his bottom at the top of the strip, he suddenly launched himself to go whizzing down. He had made a slide, and soon all the children were shooting down it, whooping with excitement. On another day, he got all his brothers and sisters to collect empty acorn cups. They found a lot of them just by digging inside the 3 compost heaps. Then they all went off to the stream at the end of the forest and floated the little acorn cups in the water. Like little boats, the acorn cups were carried along by the stream. "It's a race," Spud declared, whereupon everyone except Jojo started to chase along the side of the stream, shouting and screaming to see whose boat would be the winner. Jojo wasn't at all happy at being left behind. When they got back, they found him crying and trying to get out of his cart. "You are still too small to play near the water," Spud attempted to explain to his baby brother. But Jojo still didn't understand words and continued to whimper. Seraphine always preferred to play with the Niffy-Pong children out in the open, because if they stayed inside under the compost heap where they lived, it could be very smelly, and was even worse on hot summer days. Of course, the Niffy-Pong children didn't mind being a bit dirty and smelly, because that's what happened if you lived under a compost heap. Besides, they had grown so used to it that they no longer noticed how stinky and mucky they sometimes were. Now, the strange thing was that as they played with Spud and Nesta so much, Pumpkin and Pickle began to forget about the smells, pongs and odours that forever seemed to cling to their little friends. Suddenly realizing this one day, Pickle turned to his brother and said, "I'm not going to wash any more." Pumpkin was a little surprised and thought about it for a moment or so, and then replied, "I agree. It's a waste of time. I'm not going to wash either." It wasn't that Pickle and Pumpkin didn't like water. They loved it when they could cool their feet in the big pond on hot days, or splash about having fun in the stream at the end of the little forest. They also knew how important water was for all the flowers, vegetables, trees, bushes and creatures in the garden. And when they had been running about a lot and had got very thirsty, the best thing in the world was to have a long, cool drink. No, their problem was that none of the little people could get water in the same way as the big people who lived in the large house. Pickle and Pumpkin would have marvelled to see water flowing from a tap that Leo or Felicity had just turned on. They would have had an even bigger surprise to see a toilet working. All you had to do was press a lever, and, as if by magic, a huge gush of water would suddenly gurgle and splash to flush everything away. Even Jacob's hosepipe was a thing of wonder to all the little people in Heatherfield Farm, because they just could not understand how the water got into the pipe or where it came from. There were no basins, baths, showers or toilets in any of the Tiddlewit, Niffypong or Wahoo households, where you could simply turn on a tap or pull a lever to get water. If they wanted clean water, it had to be drawn from 2 secret wells that Mr. Niffypong's great-great-grandfather had deeply dug many, many years ago. A little bucket on the end of a very long rope would be lowered into the well until it finally found some water, and then, when filled, would be hauled up to the top again. It was very hard work having to collect and carry water this way, so all the little people made sure they never wasted any. Pickle and Pumpkin didn't mind washing their hands or their faces, but they hated having a complete wash just before they went to bed. Instead of a bath, the boys had to stand in a bowl that Mrs. Tiddlewit put on the floor. Then she would fill up a big jug with cold water and pour it over them, giving them a good scrub. The boys always wished it could be hot water, especially in winter time when it was very cold. But it would have taken far too long to boil, even on the small kitchen stove. "We don't want a wash tonight," Pickle informed his mother. "Why ever not?" Mrs. Tiddlewit looked very surprised. Pickle went into a long explanation about how cold it always was, how much hard work it was to get water from the well, and how happy the Niffypongs always seemed to be without having to go to all the trouble of getting clean. Mrs. Tiddlewit was not impressed. "I'm not having dirty, smelly boys in my house," she insisted. "If you don't have a good wash every evening, you'll just have to stay outside," she added, stamping her little foot on the ground to emphasize her point. Mrs. Tiddlewit then turned to Mr. Tiddlewit, seeking his support. "So, what do you say to that, Mr. Tiddlewit?" she asked. Mr. Tiddlewit thought for a while, remembering how he too never liked washing when he was a little boy. And then he laughed. "Well, why don't we let them try it for a bit? My guess is that they'll soon get tired of it. But I agree, you boys will have to stay outside if you choose to be ponging and mucky." Mrs. Tiddlewit was not happy. She had hoped Mr. Tiddlewit would tell the boys to have a wash. "Mr. Tiddlewit," she complained, "you're far too soft with these boys." Don't fret, my dear," Mr. Tiddlewit attempted to soothe his wife. "I bet you that within a week those boys will be cleaner than any of us. Just you wait and see." Pickle and Pumpkin were not allowed to have their supper in their house under the old oak tree. Instead, they had to eat it outside, sitting on the grass. They even had to stay outside when it was time to go to bed. Mrs. Tiddlewit still refused to let them in and told them to go and sleep under a nearby bush. They weren't even permitted to have their nice blankets or pillows, because she said they would get too dirty. So, instead, they had to be content with 2 old sacks that Mr. Tiddlewit found for them. At first, Pickle and Pumpkin thought this was all great fun. It was a warm evening, and being outside was just like camping. As it got darker, the boys settled down under the bush, covering themselves with the sacks. Normally, when they were inside the house and in their proper beds, they would fall asleep almost immediately, but now it was all very different. First, they started to hear all sorts of noises that kept them awake. An owl began to go, "Twit-to-woo, twit-to-woo." It kept doing this, and the boys wondered if it would ever stop. Then, just as they had begun to get sleepy, they were startled to hear the barking of a fox. What worried them was it seemed to be close by. In fact, it was some way away in a nearby field, but it didn't seem like that to the boys, who now nestled up close to each other for protection. "What's that?" Pumpkin suddenly sat up, half getting out of his sack. "What do you mean, what's that?" Pickle reacted, rather annoyed because he had just gone to sleep. "I heard a rustling in the leaves," Pumpkin whispered, and now Pickle could hear it too. Both boys peered into the dark, trying to make out what the noise was and where it was coming from. "I think it's a rat," Pickle cried, thinking he was about to get bitten. "It can't be," Pumpkin replied. "I haven't seen any rats around here for ages." The rustling noise continued. "What if it's a snake?" Pickle suddenly sounded very frightened. This was all too much for Pumpkin. He suddenly got up and ran towards the house. As soon as he got there, he tried the door handle, expecting the door to open, but it would not. He had forgotten that his father always locked the door at night. Looking around in desperation, he noticed Pickle pointing at something. It was a tiny field mouse, and it looked almost as frightened as Pumpkin. "There's your snake, Pumpkin," Pickle whispered loudly to his brother, and then began to laugh and roll around on the grass. Pickle felt very stupid that it had been a timid little field mouse that had frightened him, so he tried to excuse himself, saying, "Well, it could have been something very dangerous. You just cannot tell when it's very dark." Indeed, it was very dark, because that night there was no moon. It was so dark that Pickle and Pumpkin now bumped into each other trying to find the bush they had been sleeping under. "Mind where you're going," Pumpkin complained. "No, you mind where you're going," Pickle replied irritably. It seemed the boys were not enjoying themselves as much as they had hoped, and it became even worse because ants and spiders had got into their sacks and started to tickle them. Itching and scratching, Pumpkin and Pickle were forced to throw off the sacks, and so no longer had anything to cover them. It wasn't long before they both began to feel very cold, because the night air had begun to turn into a damp mist. In the end, Pickle and Pumpkin were so tired that finally they fell asleep. However, their slumber did not last. Long before the sun rose and there was only a small glimmer of light on the horizon, all the birds in fields, bushes, trees, and on rooftops began to sing. If they had been tucked up in bed inside the old oak tree, Pickle and Pumpkin would never have heard them. But they were not, and so the loud twitter, tweet, and chirping of 1,000 birds soon had them wide awake. Bleary-eyed, the boys felt their stiff, achy little bodies. They stretched, shivered, and dearly hoped the sun would soon appear to warm them. "I'm hungry," Pickle moaned. "And I'm thirsty," Pumpkin sighed, but both boys knew it was far too early for them to have breakfast. Besides, their mother, father, and Seraphine were almost certainly still fast asleep, cosy in their soft beds. Pickle was thinking of a large slice of buttered toast with raspberry jam on it, whilst Pumpkin dreamed of holding a big mug of very hot tea sweetened with honey. Sadly, the more they thought of these things, it seemed the hungrier and thirstier they became. In the end, Pumpkin declared, "I can't wait any longer. I'm going to see if Mummy has woken up." With that, he got up, emerging from under their bush to once more make for the front door of the old oak tree. The door was still locked, so instead he had to knock on it. He waited for some while, but there was no answer. Now he started to beat on the door very loudly. Still, no one came to the door. Pickle now joined his brother, banging on the door so hard that it creaked and shuddered. Suddenly the door opened outwards, almost knocking the two boys over. "What on earth is this dreadful noise?" their father complained. He looked very sleepy and didn't seem at all happy that he'd just been woken up. "We want our breakfast," both boys immediately demanded. "Mummy is still fast asleep," Mr. Tittlewit countered. "You'll just have to wait." "We can't wait," the boys began to snivel. Looking at Pickle and Pumpkin, Mr. Tittlewit finally took pity on them. They had mud on them, there were leaves and bits of grass in their hair, their clothes were damp, and it looked as if they were shaking with cold. All right, lads," Mr. Tittlewit relented. "I'll see if I can find anything, but I'm afraid you still can't come in the house looking like that." Mr. Tittlewit couldn't find any bread because Mrs. Tittlewit hadn't made any. She would do that when she got up. Instead, all that Mr. Tittlewit could find was some cold stewed cabbage and 3 carrots. "We can't eat that," Pumpkin looked aghast. "That's not what we have for breakfast." "Well, lads," Mr. Tittlewit commiserated, "that's all there is at the moment. You'll just have to wait until your mother's up and about." With that, Mr. Tittlewit said, "See you later," and promptly shut the door, because he was only in his nightshirt and he was getting rather chilly. Starving and desperate, Pickle and Pumpkin finally sat down to eat their cold stewed cabbage and raw carrots. "This might be all right for rabbits," Pickle complained bitterly, "but it's not what I want for my breakfast." "And I still haven't had my drink," Pumpkin added, looking very miserable. It was another 3 hours before the boys got what they wanted. The sun was climbing up into the sky, warming the air and encouraging all the flowers to open and spread their perfumes, and Mrs. Tittlewit had finally made the bread. Pickle and Pumpkin had smelt its wonderful aroma long before it was ready, and this made them even hungrier. At last the front door opened for Mrs. Tittlewit to deposit a large plate of toast and raspberry jam, together with mugs of hot tea on a little bench. Pickle and Pumpkin thought it was the best breakfast they had ever had. "Now, you two, don't gobble all that toast or you'll have tummy aches," Mrs. Tittlewit warned, but the boys were too hungry to listen. Later that morning, Spud came round to the old oak tree. He was very fond of Seraphine and tried to be with her as often as possible. He had brought a little posy of flowers that he had picked along the way. Seraphine was very happy to see Spud because he was not only kind, but under all the dirt he was also a very handsome boy. "I'll just put these flowers in some water and then we can go for a little walk," she informed, whilst at the same time instructing Spud not to come into the house. As with Pumpkin and Pickle, there was no room for smelly boys in the neat little home under the old oak tree. Walking through the orchard, Spud suddenly commented, "I haven't seen Pumpkin or Pickle. Where are they?" Seraphine was a bit embarrassed when she tried to explain why her brothers were not allowed into the house. "They said they wanted to be like you, Spud. They didn't see the point of washing." Spud was a little surprised, and even a little hurt, although he did have to admit he did get rather mucky and stinky at times. "The trouble is," he said, trying to excuse himself, "when you live and work in a compost heap, it's very difficult not to get dirty. No sooner than you've had a wash, it seems to get all filthy again." "Never mind, Spud, I like you just as you are," Seraphine said, hoping that she hadn't made him feel sad. Now that Pumpkin and Pickle had full tummies and had warmed up a bit, they felt much happier and were still determined not to start washing. "Mummy still won't let us in the house, and it was really horrible having to sleep outside," Pumpkin reminded his brother. Pickle thought about it and then had an idea. "Maybe the Niffypongs will let us stay with them." At first, Pumpkin thought this was brilliant, but then remembered when he had last been to see them under the compost. There were 7 Niffypongs, and it was obvious they were all squeezed in very tight. "I don't think it will work. There's just not enough room for us there," Pumpkin concluded. "Well, I'm not going home yet," Pickle insisted. "Otherwise it will look like Mummy and Daddy were right and we were wrong. What we need to do is to build a proper shelter." Pumpkin thought about it and started to become very excited. It would be quite an adventure for them to build their own little shelter, protected from the cold, wind and rain. So they immediately began to look for long sticks, string, and any old bits of material they could find. When they had all they needed, they chose what they thought was a protected spot and began to construct their little home. After some hours, they had completed their task and were very proud of what they had done. The long sticks had been stuck in the ground to form a kind of pyramid, and over it the boys had wrapped one of Jacob's large plastic bags that used to hold fertilizer. The shelter looked very much like a tent and was quite dark inside. "Now we need something soft to lie on," Pumpkin suggested. So for the next hour the boys gathered big heaps of moss and dry leaves and put them on the floor of their new home. That night, warm in their sacks, Pickle and Pumpkin had a very good sleep. In fact, they slept so long they almost got up too late to have their breakfast. It was only because Mr. Tiddlewit came to look for them that they realized it was time for toast and tea. When Mr. Tiddlewit saw the shelter, he was not only very surprised, he was also very proud of what his sons had been able to do. "Come along here, darling," he called to Mrs. Tiddlewit. "I want to show you something." So saying, Mr. Tiddlewit took his wife to see the shelter. She also was surprised and proud when she saw what her boys had achieved. But then she began to worry. If the boys were happy to be outside, she thought, they would probably stay unwashed and never come back into their little house under the old oak tree. "Ah, don't you worry," Mr. Tiddlewit chuckled. "They'll be back indoors soon enough." At first, Pickle and Pumpkin seemed to enjoy themselves living outside, only going home whenever they needed to be fed. But then they began to have problems. Pickle's tummy started to tickle, and then it began to itch, and finally it became rather sore. Pumpkin had a similar problem, except the itchy bit appeared on his bottom, and it was no longer nice to sit down. The boys noticed something else. Something seemed to be crawling about in their hair, and was tickling them all the time. Of course, by now, they were very mucky and smelly indeed. They were so smelly that big flies followed them everywhere, thinking they would be nice to lick, and worst of all, other insects now crawled onto them at night and bit them. Pickle and Pumpkin began to worry. One morning the boys were sitting on a log in the orchard when they saw Spud approaching. He was on his way to see Seraphine. At first, Pickle and Pumpkin didn't recognize their friend because there was something different about him. And then they realized what it was. He was clean. Apart from a small splash of blackcurrant juice on his very white shirt, there was not a single speck of dirt on him. He had even combed his hair and brushed his clogs. As he got closer, Pickle and Pumpkin got the biggest shock of all. Spud was no longer stinky. He did smell, but it was something beautifully fragrant like crushed flowers. Just as they were marvelling at this transformation in their friend, Nesta appeared from behind a tree. She was wearing a pretty dress, crisp and freshly ironed. Her hair, which had always looked brown and muddy, now shone like yellow silk and was tied with bright green ribbons. Pickle and Pumpkin had never seen her looking so pretty. Without thinking what he was saying, Pumpkin blurted, "But you're meant to be smelly and dirty." Spud and Nesta pretended they were very offended, but then began to laugh. Spud thought it was time to explain. After Seraphine had told him he was a bit stinky and mucky, Spud had decided to make a big effort to get clean. Then, seeing how good her brother looked, Nesta also decided to have a good wash. Proud of their wonderful transformation, they immediately went to show themselves to Seraphine. When she saw them, Seraphine was amazed and hugged them both. She even invited Spud and Nesta into the old oak tree for the first time. There she gave Nesta one of her dresses and some ribbons for her hair. In fact, these were the things that Nesta was now wearing. Seraphine had also given them little bottles of lavender and rose water, so that it would make them smell nice. Spud now began to take a closer look at Pickle and Pumpkin, comparing himself with them, and even sniffing them. "If you don't mind me saying, you two are really scruffy and you smell horrible," he said, and then began to laugh. Pickle and Pumpkin immediately looked at each other and seemed to have the same idea. They turned round and, to the surprise of Spud and Nesta, began to run. They ran and they ran, with orchard trees whizzing past them, until, at last, the boys came to the big pond. Without stopping or even taking their clothes off, they suddenly took a great leap into the air and landed in the water with a big splash that frightened both Mrs. Duck and the moorhen, who had been fast asleep on the island. After scrubbing themselves very hard, the boys finally emerged from the pond, soaking wet and with bits of pondweed drooped and dripping in their hair. "I've had enough of being mucky and smelly," Pickle admitted, coughing up some water. "Me too," Pumpkin agreed. So both boys decided to make their way home to tell their mother. Mrs. Tittlewit was delighted that Pickle and Pumpkin had decided that it was a much better idea to have a very good wash each day. "See what I told you?" Mr. Tittlewit reminded his wife with a triumphant but gentle slap on her bottom. "I told you they'd tire of it. Sometimes you have to let youngsters find out these things for themselves." Sadly, that was not the end of the story. Pickle and Pumpkin had to see Dr. Wahoo about the insect bites and the sore red rashes they had acquired whilst living outside. He gave them both a special ointment that they had to use for at least a week. Dr. Wahoo also took a look to see what was making their hair tickle. "Oh dear me," he exclaimed to Mrs. Tittlewit, "they've both got nits." Mrs. Tittlewit was horrified, because nits are very tiny insects. They are so tiny you can hardly see them as they bite, feed on blood, and lay their eggs in your hair. "I can give you this special mixture for the boys," Dr. Wahoo advised. "You'll have to rub it into their heads, but to make sure, you really need to do something else." Dr. Wahoo then whispered into Mrs. Tittlewit's ear. The boys were about to get a nasty surprise. To get rid of the nits, the boys would have to have all their hair cut off. At first, Pumpkin and Pickle resisted, but the itching got so bad that they finally had to agree. It was Mr. Tittlewit who did the cutting with a big pair of scissors. Very soon both boys were almost as bald as chicken eggs, and had to wear hats for 2 weeks before their hair decided to grow back again. It was very embarrassing, because the Niffipong children couldn't stop giggling when they saw Pumpkin and Pickle without any hair. "Well, that was pretty soppy of us getting mucky and smelly. I'm not going to do that again," Pickle grumbled as he checked in a mirror to see if his hair was growing. Pumpkin agreed, and was very happy that he could once again sleep in his comfortable bed and know that when he woke up in the morning he would get a hot mug of tea and a lovely thick slice of toast covered in melting butter and raspberry jam.